On a humid Monday morning in August of 1981, James Edward Carlson arrived at the sprawling industrial facility on the outskirts of Syracuse, New York, carrying his lunch pail and a thermos of coffee, believing he was about to begin another routine week teaching industrial automation techniques to foreign engineering students. He had been conducting these training sessions for nearly 3 years, proud of his role in what he understood to be an international education program that strengthened America's relationships with developing nations. He had no reason to suspect that the eager students who hung on his every word, who asked such thoughtful questions about manufacturing processes and quality control systems, were not students at all. They were intelligence officers from the Soviet Union and its Warsaw Pact allies, systematically extracting knowledge that would help them overcome critical technological gaps in their own industrial capabilities. What James believed about his work, about the program's purpose, about the harmless transfer of basic manufacturing skills, would prove to be catastrophically, devastatingly wrong. This is the story of how an ordinary factory worker became an unwitting participant in one of the most sophisticated technology transfer operations of the Cold War, and how a series of small observations would eventually reveal that he had spent years training the very people his country considered adversaries. It is a story about deception operating at scales both vast and intimate, about the weaponization of American openness and expertise, and about the moment when comfortable assumptions shatter against the hard reality of international espionage. But before we dive into this story, make sure to leave a like and subscribe to the channel so we can bring you the most gripping Cold War and espionage stories every day. And tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It really helps support us. James Edward Carlson was 47 years old. That August, a third-generation machinist who had worked at Precision Dynamics Manufacturing since graduating from technical school in 1952. The company specialized in producing high-tolerance components for aerospace and defense applications, the kind of precision work that required both advanced machinery and highly skilled operators who understood tolerances measured in thousandths of an inch. James had spent nearly 3 decades mastering his craft, progressing from apprentice machinist to senior operator to his current position as lead training instructor, responsible for teaching new employees and, as of 1978, participants in what was called the International Technical Exchange Program. The program had been introduced to James and his colleagues as a goodwill initiative, part of the broader policy of détente that characterized American-Soviet relations in the late 1970s. The idea seemed straightforward and even noble. Foreign engineers and technicians from various countries would visit American manufacturing facilities, observe production processes, receive training in modern industrial techniques, and return to their home countries with knowledge that would help them modernize their own industries. The program was administered through a consortium of universities and trade organizations, with government oversight that James assumed guaranteed its legitimacy and safety. James had been selected as an instructor because of his teaching ability and his comprehensive knowledge of computer numerical control machinery, the cutting-edge technology that was revolutionizing American manufacturing. CNC machines used computer programs to control machine tools, allowing for precision and consistency that manual operation could never achieve. The technology represented a significant leap forward in manufacturing capability, and American companies led the world in its development and application. James felt genuine pride in sharing this knowledge, believing he was contributing to global industrial progress while also showcasing American technological superiority. The foreign visitors who participated in the program arrived in groups of 6 to 8, staying for periods ranging from 2 weeks to 2 months. They came from various countries, Poland, East Germany, Czechoslovakia, Romania, and occasionally from the Soviet Union itself, though the Russians were always described as representing specific industrial ministries or research institutes rather than military or intelligence agencies. The program coordinators, earnest academics from nearby Syracuse University who handled logistics and translation, assured James and his colleagues that all participants had been thoroughly vetted and that the training focused only on civilian manufacturing applications, with no military relevance. James found the students attentive and respectful, though their demeanor often struck him as more formal and serious than typical American trainees. They arrived each morning in groups, always punctual, always prepared with notebooks and cameras for documenting the training sessions. Their questions were detailed and specific, demonstrating a level of preparation that suggested they had studied American manufacturing techniques extensively before arriving. James appreciated their diligence, though he sometimes found their intensity slightly unsettling. They did not engage in the casual banter and joking that characterized interactions among American workers. They remained focused on the technical material, treating each training session as though it were a critical mission rather than an educational opportunity. The training curriculum James delivered covered a wide range of topics: the operation of computer numerical control lathes and milling machines, programming techniques for automated manufacturing systems, quality control procedures using statistical process control, maintenance protocols for precision equipment, and problem-solving, methodologies for addressing production challenges. Each session combined classroom instruction with hands-on demonstrations in the machine shop, where students could observe actual production runs and, under careful supervision, operate equipment themselves. James took pride in his thoroughness, ensuring that students understood not just how to perform tasks, but why specific approaches worked better than alternatives. What James did not fully grasp was the strategic value of the information he was providing. While the techniques seemed basic to him, routine knowledge that any competent machinist would possess, they represented solutions to problems that Soviet and Eastern Bloc manufacturers had struggled with for decades. The precision tolerances, the quality control methodologies, the programming approaches for CNC equipment, all of this constituted technology that gave American manufacturers critical advantages in producing everything from aircraft components to missile guidance systems. By mastering these techniques, Soviet industry could close gaps that had hindered their ability to compete with Western manufacturing capabilities. The first hint that something might be wrong came not from anything dramatic, but from a small observation that James initially dismissed as irrelevant. It was a Thursday afternoon in September, and James was conducting a session on programming CNC milling machines for a group of 6 engineers who had been introduced as representing a Romanian agricultural equipment manufacturer. They were learning how to create programs that would machine complex parts with minimal setup time and maximum precision, skills that would supposedly help them produce better farm equipment for Romanian farmers. During a break, while the students examined a sample part James had machined as a demonstration, he overheard 2 of them speaking in their native language. James understood no Romanian, but he noticed that one of the men was sketching something in his notebook, a detailed diagram that looked nothing like agricultural equipment. James caught only a brief glimpse before the man noticed his attention and closed the notebook, but what he had seen appeared to be a component from a jet engine turbine, specifically the kind of precision blade assembly used in military aircraft. The sketch included notations about tolerances and material specifications that James recognized from his work on defense contracts. James told himself he must have been mistaken. Perhaps it was simply a generic mechanical drawing that happened to resemble aircraft components. Perhaps the man was sketching from memory something he had seen elsewhere, unrelated to the training program. But the incident lodged in his mind like a splinter, small but irritating, generating a discomfort he could not quite rationalize away. He found himself watching the Romanian group more carefully during subsequent sessions, paying attention to which topics seemed to interest them most, noticing that their questions often focused on the specific techniques used in high-stress applications, where parts had to maintain tight tolerances under extreme conditions, exactly the kind of requirements found in military and aerospace systems. 2 weeks later, another incident deepened James's unease. A group of East German engineers was visiting, supposedly from a company that manufactured precision instruments for medical applications. James was demonstrating quality control procedures, showing them how to use coordinate measuring machines to verify that parts met specifications. One of the Germans, a man in his early 40s with wire-rimmed glasses and a severe expression, asked a series of highly technical questions about measuring techniques for components that would be subjected to high G-forces and extreme temperature variations. These were not conditions typically encountered in medical equipment manufacturing, but they were exactly the conditions found in missile systems and high-performance aircraft. James answered the questions professionally, as he had been trained to do, providing the technical information requested. But afterward, he found himself troubled by the exchange. Why would someone supposedly working in medical equipment need to understand measurement techniques for extreme aerospace applications? The explanation that came to mind, that the engineer was simply curious or interested in expanding his general knowledge, felt inadequate. The questions had been too specific, too focused, too purposeful to represent mere intellectual curiosity. That evening, James mentioned his concerns to his wife, Dorothy, a practical woman who had worked as a school librarian for 20 years and possessed what James considered excellent judgment about people and situations. They sat in their kitchen, the same Formica table where they had eaten dinner for 18 years, and James described what he had observed: the sketches, the oddly specific questions, the sense that something about the program did not quite align with its stated purposes. Dorothy listened carefully, then asked the obvious question. "Have you talked to your supervisors about this? If something seems wrong, shouldn't you report it?" James had considered this, but he felt paralyzed by uncertainty. Report what, exactly? That some foreign engineers asked technical questions? That I glimpsed a drawing that might have been something other than farm equipment? I have no proof of anything wrong. The program is administered through the university and has government approval. If I start making accusations without evidence, I'll look paranoid, or worse, I'll look like I'm trying to sabotage an official program because I'm uncomfortable with foreigners. This fear was not irrational. The year was 1981, and while Cold War tensions were intensifying under the new Reagan administration, the previous decade of détente had created an atmosphere where expressing suspicion of Soviet or Eastern Bloc nationals could be characterized as reactionary or xenophobic. The university coordinators who administered the program were earnest believers in international cooperation and cultural exchange. They would likely dismiss concerns about espionage as Cold War paranoia, especially coming from a factory worker with no intelligence training or expertise. But Dorothy, with her librarian's instinct for research and verification, suggested a different approach. What if you just documented what you're seeing? Keep notes about the questions they ask, the topics they seem most interested in, any observations that trouble you. You don't have to make accusations or report anything yet. Just create a record so that if something does turn out to be wrong, you'll have detailed information to provide. This seemed like a reasonable middle ground. James began keeping a small notebook, recording the dates of training sessions, the countries the participants claimed to represent, the companies they supposedly worked for, and the specific topics that generated the most interest and detailed questioning. He noted when students photographed particular equipment setups or manufacturing processes. He recorded questions that seemed inconsistent with the participants' stated backgrounds or company affiliations. He paid attention to the technical level of the questions being asked, recognizing that some participants demonstrated knowledge far more sophisticated than would be expected from the roles they claimed to occupy in their home industries. Over the next several months, a pattern emerged from James's observations that he found increasingly disturbing. The students who supposedly came from civilian manufacturing companies consistently asked questions about techniques used in military applications. They showed particular interest in materials that could withstand extreme temperatures and pressures, the kind of materials used in rocket motors and jet engines. They focused extensively on precision machining techniques for complex three-dimensional geometries, the kind required for turbine blades and missile components. They asked detailed questions about quality control for safety-critical parts, exactly the kind of quality standards demanded in aerospace and defense work. Furthermore, James noticed that the technical sophistication of many participants exceeded what their claimed backgrounds would suggest. A man supposedly working as a quality control supervisor at a Polish factory that made industrial pumps asked questions about measurement techniques that revealed an understanding of advanced metallurgy and materials science. A woman introduced as a production planner from a Czech company asked about manufacturing sequences for parts that required exotic alloys rarely used outside military applications. A Russian engineer supposedly involved in agricultural equipment production demonstrated familiarity with computer programming languages, specifically developed for defense manufacturing systems. The accumulation of these observations created a picture that James could no longer ignore. He was not training civilian industrial workers to make better tractors and medical equipment. He was training intelligence operatives and military engineers to replicate American manufacturing capabilities in areas directly relevant to weapons production and aerospace systems. The International Technical Exchange Program was not a goodwill initiative promoting global industrial progress. It was a technology transfer operation, systematically extracting American manufacturing knowledge and delivering it to countries that remained, despite the rhetoric of détente, adversaries of the United States. The realization filled James with a complex mixture of anger, guilt, and fear. Anger at having been deceived, at having his expertise and goodwill exploited for purposes that contradicted his values and potentially harmed his country's security. Guilt at having provided this training, at having answered those questions, at having been complicit, however unwittingly, in technology transfer that might help Soviet and Warsaw-packed industries produce better weapons systems. Fear about what might happen if he came forward with his suspicions, whether he would be believed, whether he might face consequences for having participated in the program, whether speaking out might cost him his job or expose him to retaliation. Dorothy urged him to contact the FBI, but James hesitated. His notebook contained observations and suspicions, not proof. He had no hard evidence of espionage, no documents showing that the program was anything other than what it claimed to be. The university coordinators would vouch for the program's legitimacy. The participants all had official documentation, visas, and credentials that had presumably been reviewed by government officials. What could James offer beyond his gut feeling that something was wrong? The decision was made for him in November of 1981, when a new group arrived that included a Soviet engineer named Viktor Sokolov. Sokolov was introduced as a senior technical advisor from a ministry overseeing civilian aviation manufacturing, supposedly interested in learning American techniques for producing aircraft components for commercial airliners. He was approximately 50 years old, with a stocky build, thinning gray hair, and the kind of confident, commanding presence that suggested significant authority. Unlike most participants in the program, who maintained a deferential attitude toward James as their instructor, Sokolov carried himself as an equal, or even a superior, someone accustomed to being obeyed rather than instructed. From the first training session, James noticed that Sokolov's questions were different in character from those asked by other participants. While most students asked about how to perform specific techniques, Sokolov asked about why particular approaches had been developed, what problems they solved, what alternatives had been considered and rejected. His questions revealed an understanding of American manufacturing evolution that went far beyond what any foreign engineer should possess. He knew about specific research programs, particular innovations developed by individual American companies, even details about manufacturing challenges that American aerospace firms had faced and overcome. During a hands-on session in the machine shop, James watched Sokolov examine a CNC milling machine with an intensity that went beyond normal student interest. Sokolov ran his hands over the machine's components, studied the control interface with focused attention, and asked James detailed questions about the machine's specifications, the tolerances it could achieve, the materials it could process, the size and complexity of parts it could produce. Then Sokolov asked a question that sent chills down James's spine. This machine, it could produce turbine blades for jet engines, yes? The kind used in military aircraft, not just commercial planes. James felt his mouth go dry. The question was not technically inappropriate. CNC mills absolutely could produce turbine blades for any application, but the directness of asking specifically about military applications shattered the pretense that had governed all previous interactions. Sokolov was not even attempting to maintain the fiction of civilian interest. He was openly acknowledging the military relevance of the training. James gave a carefully neutral answer. This type of machine is used in many applications. I teach general techniques, not specific products or applications. Sokolov smiled, a thin expression that contained what seemed like amusement at James's caution. Of course, general techniques, very valuable general techniques that apply to so many interesting problems. That afternoon, James left work early, claiming he felt ill. He drove to a payphone several blocks from his house and called the Federal Bureau of Investigation office in Syracuse. His heart pounded as he explained to the operator that he had information about possible technology transfer to Soviet bloc countries and needed to speak with someone in counterintelligence. He was asked to hold, transferred twice, and finally connected to a special agent named Robert Marchetti. Agent Marchetti listened as James described the training program, his observations over the past months, the pattern of questions from participants, and the disturbing interaction with Viktor Sokolov. When James finished, there was a long pause before Marchetti responded. Mr. Carlson, I need you to understand something. The program you're describing, we're aware of it. We've had concerns about it for some time. But these programs have political approval at high levels. They're administered through legitimate academic institutions, and shutting them down or investigating them openly would create significant diplomatic complications. What I'm about to tell you must remain completely confidential. Can you agree to that? James agreed, and Marchetti continued. We believe that several Eastern Bloc intelligence services have been using educational exchange programs as cover for technology acquisition operations. They send engineers and technical specialists, many of whom do work in civilian industries, but also have connections to military research institutes, and they systematically gather information about American manufacturing capabilities, not to steal any one particular secret, but to learn the accumulated knowledge and techniques that give American industry its advantages. It's incredibly difficult to prove or stop because no single piece of information is classified. No individual question is inappropriate, but collectively, they're conducting an intelligence operation. James felt validation and horror in equal measure. His suspicions had been correct. But learning that the FBI already knew about the problem and felt powerless to stop it was deeply unsettling. So what am I supposed to do? Keep training these people? Keep helping them learn how to replicate American capabilities? For now, yes, Marchetti said, and James could hear the frustration in the agent's voice. We need you to continue exactly as you have been, but we also need you to do something for us. We need detailed documentation of every participant, what they ask about, what they photograph, what seems to interest them most. We need you to note any conversations you overhear between participants, any observations about their backgrounds or expertise that seem inconsistent with their claimed positions. You're in a unique position, Mr. Carlson. You're seeing these operations up close, and you have the technical knowledge to understand what they're really after. Will you help us? James thought about his comfortable life, his approaching retirement, the risks of becoming involved in counterintelligence operations. He thought about his father, who had fought in World War II, and his grandfather, who had served in World War I, and the tradition of service that ran through his family. He thought about the knowledge he had already provided to people who would use it against American interests, and his complicity, however unwitting, in technology transfer that might ultimately cost American lives if it helped Soviet industry produce better weapons. Yes, James said. I'll help. Tell me what you need me to do. Over the next 14 months, James Carlson became an informant for the Federal Bureau of Investigation, documenting the activities of participants in the International Technical Exchange Program while maintaining his role as their instructor. Agent Marchetti provided him with specific guidance on what information was most valuable. Not just who asked what questions, but the technical sophistication they demonstrated, any names or institutions they mentioned, any insights into how the acquired knowledge would be used back in their home countries. The work was psychologically exhausting. James had to smile and teach people he now understood were intelligence operatives. He had to answer their questions thoroughly and professionally while simultaneously documenting those questions for FBI analysis. He had to maintain absolute secrecy about his cooperation with the FBI, telling no one except Dorothy, who lived with the constant low-level anxiety that their involvement might be discovered. The dual role created a constant state of tension, and James found himself having difficulty sleeping, troubled by the knowledge of what he was participating in and uncertain whether his documentation was making any difference. The breakthrough came in January of 1983, when a group arrived that included 3 engineers supposedly from an East German industrial equipment manufacturer. One of them, introduced as Hans Müller, immediately drew James's attention because of his behavior during the first training session. While his colleagues took notes and asked questions about the material James was presenting, Muller seemed more interested in the facility itself. His eyes constantly scanned the machine shop, studying the layout, the equipment placement, the security measures, the locations of offices and storage areas. During a break, James observed Muller walking through areas of the facility that were off-limits to program participants, supposedly looking for a restroom, but actually examining manufacturing areas where classified defense work was conducted. When James politely redirected him back to the authorized training area, Muller apologized smoothly, but James had seen the calculated way Muller's eyes had cataloged everything he passed. That evening, James called Agent Marchetti and described Muller's behavior. The unauthorized wandering, the excessive interest in facility security, the sense that Mueller was conducting reconnaissance rather than attending training. Marchetti listened intently and asked James to do something that made him profoundly uncomfortable. The agent wanted James to deliberately make himself vulnerable, to mention in Mueller's presence that he sometimes worked late in the facility alone, to create an opportunity for Mueller to attempt unauthorized access or recruitment. James understood the logic. If Mueller was indeed an intelligence operative rather than a student, he might try to cultivate James as a source or attempt to access areas of the facility outside normal training hours. But the prospect of deliberately attracting the attention of foreign intelligence officers terrified him. Dorothy was even more opposed, arguing that James had already done enough, that the FBI should handle active operations without putting civilian informants at risk. But James agreed, partly from a sense of duty, partly from a desire to bring the situation to resolution one way or another. Those following week, he made sure to mention within Mueller's hearing that he often stayed after hours to prepare training materials and to work on special projects in the machine shop. He described his schedule in enough detail that anyone paying attention would know exactly when the facility was least staffed and most vulnerable. 3 days later, on a Wednesday evening in late January, James was alone in the machine shop, supposedly working on training materials but actually waiting to see if Mueller would take the bait. FBI agents were stationed in a surveillance vehicle in the parking lot, monitoring the facility entrances and prepared to intervene if necessary. James felt his hands trembling as he tried to focus on the lathe he was operating, very much aware that he was now acting as bait in a counterintelligence operation. At 8:47, approximately 20 minutes after the last official employee had left for the evening, James heard the rear entrance door open. Footsteps approached. Through the darkened manufacturing area, trying to move quietly but still audible on the concrete floor. James continued working, pretending not to notice, his heart hammering in his chest. Hans Mueller emerged from the shadows, carrying a small camera and wearing an expression of surprise that seemed practiced rather than genuine. "Mr. Carlson, I am sorry to startle you. I left my notebook here during training today and came back to retrieve it. I did not expect anyone would still be working." The excuse was plausible, but James knew it was false. Mueller was carrying no notebook, and his camera was not the kind used for casual photography, but rather a professional device designed for document reproduction. James gave no indication of suspicion, simply greeting Mueller pleasantly and asking if he could help him find the notebook. As they talked, Mueller's demeanor shifted. He moved closer to James, his voice dropping to a more confidential tone. "Mr. Carlson, I have been very impressed by your knowledge and expertise. The training you provide is excellent, truly excellent. But I wonder if there might be opportunities for additional collaboration, perhaps consulting work, that would be very well compensated. My company would be willing to pay generously for access to your specialized knowledge on topics that we cannot cover fully during the regular training sessions." This was a recruitment pitch, carefully worded to sound like a legitimate business proposal, but actually an attempt to secure James as a source of technical information beyond what the official program provided. James felt a surge of anger that Mueller would attempt this manipulation, treating him like someone who could be bought. But he maintained his composure and expressed polite interest while carefully avoiding any commitment. The conversation was interrupted by the sudden appearance of FBI agents, who had entered the facility when Mueller triggered an alarm at the rear entrance. Mueller was detained, his camera and personal effects seized, and James was escorted from the scene by Agent Marchetti. Later, in a debriefing session that lasted past midnight, James learned the full scope of what his cooperation had revealed. Hans Mueller's real name was Klaus Richter, and he was a technical intelligence officer with the East German Ministry for State Security, the infamous Stasi. The International Technical Exchange Program had been penetrated by multiple Eastern Bloc intelligence services, just as the FBI had suspected, and they were using it to conduct systematic technology acquisition operations targeting American manufacturing capabilities. The participants were not innocent students, but carefully selected operatives with specific intelligence requirements, gathering information that would be compiled into detailed technical reports and distributed to Soviet and Warsaw Pact defense industries. The FBI's investigation, built substantially on James's documentation over the previous 14 months, had identified more than 40 individuals who had participated in the program while maintaining undisclosed connections to military research institutes or intelligence agencies. The information they had gathered encompassed a vast range of American manufacturing capabilities, from precision machining to quality control systems to computer programming techniques, all of which had direct applications in weapons production and aerospace systems. The diplomatic fallout from these revelations was significant, but carefully managed. The International Technical Exchange Program was quietly suspended, though the official explanation cited administrative difficulties rather than espionage concerns. Several participating universities were briefed on the security issues and implemented stricter vetting procedures for future international programs. Klaus Richter was declared persona non grata and expelled from the United States, as were two other participants whose covers had been compromised by the investigation. For James, the aftermath was complex. He received a commendation from the FBI, presented in a private ceremony with no media coverage or public acknowledgement. The letter, signed by the FBI director, thanked him for his cooperation in an investigation that had protected American technological advantages and exposed foreign intelligence operations. But there was no financial compensation, no job protection, no support for the psychological toll the experience had taken. James continued working at Precision Dynamics Manufacturing, but his role in the training program ended. The company was briefed on the security issues, though James's specific involvement as an FBI informant was not disclosed to protect his identity. Some of his colleagues speculated about why the international program had been canceled and whether James had played a role in that decision, but most accepted the official explanation and moved on. What haunted James most was not the danger he had faced or the stress of his double role, but rather the calculation of how much damage had already been done. He had conducted training sessions for foreign operatives for nearly 3 years before recognizing what was happening. Even after he began documenting their activities, another 14 months passed before the program was shut down. During that entire period, dozens of intelligence officers had systematically extracted American manufacturing knowledge, photographing equipment, recording processes, and compiling technical information that would help Soviet and Eastern Bloc industries close capability gaps that had previously given American manufacturers critical advantages. Agent Marchetti tried to reassure James during their final debriefing. "You need to understand, Mr. Carlson, that what you provided was invaluable. Without your documentation, we might have spent years more trying to prove that these programs were being misused for intelligence purposes. Your technical expertise allowed you to recognize what these operatives were really interested in, and your detailed notes gave us the evidence we needed to take action. Yes, some technology was transferred before we could stop it, but you prevented far more damage from occurring." But James struggled with this consolation. He thought about the turbine blade sketches, the questions about materials that could withstand extreme temperatures, the interest in precision manufacturing for aerospace applications. He thought about how that knowledge might be used to produce better jet engines for Soviet fighters, more reliable components for missile systems, improved manufacturing capabilities for weapons that might one day be used against American forces or American allies. Dorothy helped him process these feelings, as she had helped him through so many other challenges during their marriage. She reminded him that he had been deceived by people who had exploited his expertise and goodwill, that the responsibility for the technology transfer rested with those who had designed and implemented the intelligence operation, not with the unwitting instructor who had eventually recognized what was happening and taken action to stop it. She reminded him that most people would never have noticed anything wrong, would never have paid attention to the small inconsistencies and suspicious questions that had triggered James's concern. His vigilance and his willingness to come forward had made a difference, even if the full extent of that difference could never be precisely measured. Years later, after the Cold War ended and many intelligence files were declassified, James learned more about the scope of Soviet and Eastern Bloc technology acquisition operations during the 1970s and 1980s. The International Technical Exchange Program was just one of hundreds of legitimate-seeming initiatives that were exploited for intelligence purposes. Academic conferences, trade shows, factory tours, student exchange programs, scientific collaborations, all of these became venues for systematic collection of American technological knowledge. The Soviet Union and its allies invested enormous resources in these operations because they had recognized a fundamental truth. They could not match American innovation and research capabilities through their own centrally planned systems, but they could dramatically reduce the gap by studying and replicating American achievements. Technology transfer operations allowed them to leapfrog years of research and development, to learn from American mistakes and successes, to focus their limited resources on areas where they were falling furthest behind. The techniques James had taught, the precision machining methods and quality control systems that seemed so basic to him, represented solutions to problems that Soviet industry had struggled with for decades. By mastering these techniques through systematic intelligence collection, they could improve the quality and reliability of their military systems, close performance gaps that had previously favored American equipment, and maintain their status as a superpower despite fundamental economic and technological disadvantages. James eventually retired from precision dynamics manufacturing in 1995 after more than 4 decades in the industry. His career had spanned an extraordinary period of change, from the manual machining techniques of the 1950s to the computer-controlled automation of the 1990s, from the height of the Cold War to its conclusion. He had witnessed and participated in the evolution of American manufacturing from a position of undisputed global leadership to a more competitive landscape where advantages had to be actively protected against systematic intelligence operations designed to eliminate them. His involvement in exposing the misuse of the International Technical Exchange Program remained largely unknown. The FBI's commendation was classified, and James honored his commitment to secrecy about the investigation. Even after the Cold War ended and many restrictions were lifted, he rarely discussed the experience, uncomfortable with the attention it might bring, and uncertain whether his actions had ultimately mattered in the larger scheme of global events. But in the quiet moments of retirement, sitting on his porch or working in his garage on small projects that kept his machinist skills sharp, James would sometimes reflect on those years and what they had taught him. He had learned that openness and generosity, American values that he cherished, could be exploited by adversaries who saw them as weaknesses rather than strengths. He had learned that expertise carried responsibility, that knowledge had strategic value, and that sharing information required judgment about who would use it and for what purposes. Most importantly, he had learned that ordinary citizens, people with no intelligence training or government authority, could play crucial roles in protecting national security simply by paying attention, by trusting their instincts when something seemed wrong, by having the courage to speak up even when doing so was difficult or uncomfortable. The Cold War had not been won solely by diplomats and soldiers, but also by countless individuals like himself, who recognized threats, documented suspicious activities, and cooperated with authorities when asked. James Carlson died in 2007 at the age of 73. His contribution to Cold War counterintelligence known to only a few people. There was no public recognition, no newspaper obituary mentioning his role in exposing foreign intelligence operations, no monument to his service. His family knew only that he had once helped the FBI with something important, a vague description that satisfied their curiosity without revealing classified details. But in the secure files of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, preserved in the permanent record of Cold War, counterintelligence operations sits a detailed case file documenting how a factory worker's observations exposed systematic technology transfer operations that had been extracting American manufacturing knowledge for years. The file includes James's meticulous notes, the patterns he identified, the evidence he gathered that made the investigation possible. It concludes with a summary that captures the essence of his contribution to national security during a critical period of American history. Subject Carlson's technical expertise and attention to detail allowed him to recognize intelligence collection activities that had evaded detection through conventional security measures. His willingness to cooperate with the investigation, despite personal risk and professional complications, provided documentation that was instrumental in exposing foreign intelligence exploitation of international exchange programs. Subject's contribution exemplifies the crucial role that vigilant citizens can play in protecting American technological advantages against sophisticated adversary intelligence operations. That summary, buried in classified archives and read by perhaps a dozen people over the decades since it was written, represents James Edward Carlson's legacy in the secret history of the Cold War. He was an ordinary factory worker who became an extraordinary defender of American security, not through any dramatic action or heroic gesture, but through the simple decision to pay attention, to document what troubled him, and to speak up when he recognized that something was wrong. In the vast and complex struggle between East and West, between competing ideologies and rival systems, his small actions had consequences that rippled far beyond what he could have imagined when he first noticed those suspicious sketches and oddly specific questions. The Cold War taught many lessons about power, deterrence, and international competition. But it also taught that security depends, ultimately, on individuals, on their awareness, their judgment, and their willingness to trust their instincts, even when the stakes are unclear and the path forward is uncertain. James Carlson embodied those qualities, and his story serves as a reminder that the most important battles are often fought not by specialists and professionals, but by ordinary people who simply refuse to look away when something seems wrong. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. Don't forget to subscribe for more incredible stories and check out the video on screen. I'm sure you'll enjoy it. See you next time.